Hello, I'm Mishka Balsam, host of GNCC's 2020 Niagara Economic Summit series, and welcome to this, our second of a three-part weekly series where we draw on experts from around the country and the region to assess where we are right now, where we can go from here, and how we can get there. Let us acknowledge that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place. We also recognize the contributions of Métis, Inuit, and Indigenous people, both in shaping and strengthening this region in particular, and our province and country as a whole. Last week's session looked at the economic picture globally and domestically and the forces that will shape our recovery. Today's dialogue is taking an in-depth look at Niagara's opportunities for smart and sustainable regrowth that benefit the entire community. Everything from affordable housing and housing affordability to GO train and public transportation. In our final session on Tuesday, November the 24th, we'll speak to those 6 sectors hardest hit by this pandemic and the strategies that can be put in place to speed up their recovery and ensure future growth. For the next hour and a half, this session is exploring if government and businesses are up for the challenges of successive waves of pandemic. How will the economic recovery play out? And although we have seen employment gains since the beginning of the pandemic, we know that this pandemic is disproportionately affecting Canadians with lowest wages. And what are the risks regionally, nationally, and globally? This series is made possible because of our amazing partners that are by our side. Niagara Region Economic Development, Goodman School of Business, Brock University, Niagara College, DDL and Company, RBC, Deloitte, BDC, Niagara Workforce Planning Board, Pegasus Aviation, Easy Rock 105.7, and Newstalk 610 CKDB. Thank you for all that you do for the community. And here is a welcome message from Goodman School of Business, Brock University.
Hello, I'm Gervin Ferran, President of Brock University, and I am pleased to welcome you to the 2020 Niagara Economic Summit series. Because of the pandemic, we cannot be together in person this fall for the Niagara Economic Summit. But thanks to the Greater Niagara Chamber of Commerce, we have the Economic Summit series, a dynamic, forward-looking think tank that involves individuals and organizations from all across the Niagara region. At Brock University, we salute this innovative thinking and the efforts of the Chamber of Commerce and all the participants. Brock is also committed to supporting the Niagara community and region and its economic vitality. Brock's official strategic plan has 4 critical goals for the entire institution. But I should stress, one of these priorities is to enhance the life and vitality of our local region. We know that engaging with businesses, organizations, and partners throughout the region will be key to our shared economic recovery and, as well, the future competitiveness of the entire region. We work together with you because we are focused on contributing to the quality of life and the well-being of the entire Niagara community and region. Our researchers and scholars also work alongside area industries, government, agencies to constantly seek ways to improve our personal well-being as well as our collective economic health. Our students participate in your firms and organizations through co-op programs and experiential educational opportunities. Brock works with industries such as the tourism, grape and wine, and manufacturing and other industries. We work with healthcare providers and social agencies. We help municipalities plan better communities. And now Brock and its partners are already looking beyond the immediacy of the pandemic. We will all need to be part of the efforts that help our communities recover and indeed flourish after this period of COVID-19. The Economic Summit series provides a forum for all of us to learn about the opportunities and to develop shared capacity to meet the challenges before us. Let's all continue to be part of Niagara's strategy for a stronger and healthy future. On behalf of the entire Brock University community, I encourage you to participate in the Economic Summit Series and as well to enjoy all it has to offer. On behalf of all of us here at Brock University, thank you so much.
It is my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator. Dr. Suzanne Johnson is an accomplished visionary executive and the former president of Niagara Health. She has served on numerous high-profile boards across Canada and is an adjunct professor of Faculty of Applied Health at Brock University. She is also a reviewer for the Journal of Transcultural Nursing and mentors graduate students in health disciplines. She is currently a strategic advisor to the YWCA Niagara. But before passing today's event over to Dr. Johnson, here is a brief welcome message from the Canada Summer Games 2022.
For every start, there is a finish line. For every stumble, a triumph. A groundbreaking for record-breaking. Lifting these to lift these. To celebrate and inspire. With the strength of a community or the support from a familiar face. We are ready for adversity. For the hype. For the chants and cheers. For the sweat. For the tears. Once and for all.
Good morning, and welcome to this exciting panelist interview opportunity this morning we have with 4 wonderful guests here in Niagara. I'd like to introduce each panelist. Ina Braidberg works as a senior analyst, economics for Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Ina provides the CMHC with expert and in-depth analysis on the housing markets in Ontario, with a focus on the dynamic market in the Niagara region. She regularly contributes to housing market research and publications throughout the Golden Horseshoe. Brock Dickinson is an assistant director of the Economic Development Program, entrepreneur in residence, and an adjunct professor with the University of Waterloo. He was previously CEO of MDB Insight, Canada's largest specialist economic development consultancy, where he worked with hundreds of communities across North America. Brock headed a number of provincial and municipal economic development agencies in both Ontario and Nova Scotia, and has spent 6 years as a consultant with the United Nations. Doug Giles is the Director of Community and Long-Range Planning at the Niagara Region, an urban planner with international experience in both government and private sectors in the area of land use, strategic planning, policy and economic development. He's a member of the winning team in the partnership project category for the Abu Dhabi commercial signage project in the Rabdin Awards for Corporate Excellence in 2014. And Karen Pistachia is a partner with Deloitte's consulting business, leads the human capital consulting business in Toronto. She has spent her career working with organizations across Canada and the United Kingdom to drive large-scale business, life sciences, and people transformations. She's worked across financial services, healthcare, telecommunications, and media, and speaks on the topics of talent management, the multi-generational workforce, and leadership. She has also published several points of view on the future workforce, including a 2017 Human Capital Trends Report. I'd like to welcome our panelists here this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. There are many changes that we have seen as a result of the pandemic. Its response and the pandemic has changed a great deal about our economy and our society. We've had to respond and adapt. Some trends have merely accelerated, some have slowed by COVID, and others have remained unaffected. Ina, I'm interested to hear your response to this particular question or statement. We've seen the housing market seems to be immune to the economic downturn, with prices continuing to rise in Niagara, even throughout this pandemic. What causes this, and will it last?
Good morning. It's a big pleasure to be in this panel and to take part of this important conversation. I know that we're here to address trends in the Niagara region, but I feel the need to reference to other parts of Ontario as well. Over the past years, the Greater Golden Horseshoe area has become much more dynamic, fast-growing, where more companies and people move, and so housing markets have become much more interconnected. And so to address your question, I hope if I have just maybe a few minutes, I can take a few minutes of our time to provide some maybe historical overview of housing market conditions in the region, which I think is going to provide us with some maybe better sense of what is happening with housing market now and what is going to happen to housing market going forward. So maybe if I have some time, I would like to take us back to 2016 actually. It's a year when housing market condition peaked across many communities across Ontario. It was unprecedented time, and back then we did have quite strong fundamentals to support that level of activity. We had unemployment rate dropping to 7-year low. We had faster growing incomes. We had very favorable demographic conditions, growing immigration, and our demographic structure in Ontario. We have large generation of baby boomers, and the young segment of this generation are still at the peak of their careers and incomes, and they were in a position to buy homes and to help the adult children to buy homes. And we had faster growing generation of echo boomers, children of baby boomers. And they are moving into their 30s, and they were looking to decouple from their parents and buy homes on their own. And there are many other factors as well. We cannot discuss on all of them now. But at the same time, some regulatory constraints, servicing delays, maybe slow transit construction, and rising cost of construction and land and lack of land, all those factors have limited developers' ability to respond to this growing demand. And I'm talking about GTA right now. On top of it, it's not that we didn't build enough homes to meet this growing demand. We had significant shift in the composition of homes being built. So for instance, in GTA, if maybe 10, 20 years ago, apartments accounted for about 30% of construction, last year, apartments accounted for about 70% of construction, and single detached starts share was 50-year low. So there was kind of mismatch between demand and supply. So as a result, we've seen more buyers deciding to meet their needs on resale market. And we also seen more buyers decided to move outside of GTA to different parts of Ontario, including here to Niagara. So at the same time, over the many years, we didn't see significant change in MLS listings. Due to a number of reasons, we've seen more homeowners staying put in the existing properties. So essentially, over the years, we've seen more buyers chasing insufficient number of listings. It's created price pressure, and eventually it created price acceleration across many communities in Ontario. At some point between 2016 and 2018, we've seen some regulatory changes, and some of them tightened mortgage qualification requirements and made it more difficult for some home buyers to buy homes. And as a result, in 2018, more home buyers decided to put their home purchasing decisions on hold. Some needed to accumulate higher down payment. Some needed to wait until the employment and income conditions improve. Some decided to choose wait and see approach. But as a result, in 2018, housing market conditions slowed and sales declined here in Niagara and in GTA. And in GTA, we had quite significant price correction. And in 2019, at some point, sales started to recover and the pent-up demand started to realize. So finally, I'm getting to 2020, and it's what we're here to discuss, current housing market conditions. Then the virus was discovered, pandemic was declared, and multiple health and safety measures announced, which greatly impacted businesses and caused enormous employment losses, unprecedented level of uncertainty, and housing markets declined and responded fast. I think in Niagara, sales declined about 60% year over year on 1 month. In GTA, it was 70% decline, but quite fast, and to surprise of many, housing markets started to recover. And right now, they're growing at unprecedented levels. They're 50, 60% above last year's level. And I think we're even high above the peak level we saw in 2016. And year-to-date sales in Niagara region, even considering declines we saw earlier this year, they're up by 10%. So the question is what's causing it? And I would like to maybe briefly summarize the key factors what's causing this unprecedented level of sales. So first of all, this pent-up demand generated during early months of pandemic, but not only, and it's what's typically discussed by experts and media, but also pent-up demand we had from 2018 and 2019 is being realized now. Unfortunately, but this is a fact, but many young Canadians and people working at low-paid service jobs were the ones who were mainly impacted by employment losses and those pandemic measures. And they, for the most part, they have a higher propensity to be renters, and it's why it didn't impact ownership market that much. Incomes throughout this economic downturn have been quite resilient, particularly for high-paying jobs. And those buyers whose incomes and employment haven't been impacted by current pandemic losses and measures are increasingly taking advantage of all-time low mortgage rates. Immigration so far didn't have a significant impact on ownership market because immigrants tend to rent upon immediate arrival to Canada. But at some point, if immigration stays low going forward, it may impact the pool of potential first-time buyers going forward. But the last factors I would like to mention, which is very important during like today, is that we've seen a significant change in our preferences and needs. So we spend more time at home, we work from home, we have kids at home. So the need and for space, safety, for yards has really increased over the past months. And so in GTA, sales have been driven by stronger demand for single detached homes and low-rise homes in the suburbs. But here in Niagara, I think sales have also been driven by stronger movement of people from larger areas to Niagara region. And due to those needs for space, safety, and those low-rise homes.
Ina, that's an incredible amount of information that you've just provided to the panel and the panelists. I also want to let people know who are viewing at home or from their home offices that there is a chat function, and please take a look at the poll questions. The reason I wanted to mention the chat function is that we'll probably have a number of people that will want to respond to some of the comments that you made, Ina. So I just would like to take a moment and check in with the other panelists and see, are there any other comments in response to Ina's comment that anyone would like to bring forward at this moment?
I might offer up just one additional idea, and this may be a little more anecdotal than data focused, but I also think that one of the trends that we're beginning to see is that the middle-aged parent is starting to contemplate what the housing market will look like for their children in 10 or 15 years, and sort of recognizing that the buy-in costs have been escalating so rapidly that they're very concerned about the ability of their children or their nieces and nephews or whoever to be able to afford a house in the future. And I think that we're seeing some additional pressure on the market as people look to acquire second properties now as a way of building access to the housing market in the future, and often building that access for their children. And so it's just one more of those forces that sort of represented in that sudden mushrooming of demand as we kind of look at the market currently and potentially moving forward.
Exactly.
I can add to it to address those gaps in knowledge. At some point in 2017, Stats Canada conducted a survey when they measured like the share of people like in Ontario who own more than one property. And then the share in Ontario was indeed 15%. It's quite high. And
well, I just would like to just interject with a comment as well. In thinking of people who are snowbirds that have forever gone to warmer climates for the winters, and thinking about the future of housing and the way that people live, looking across the country at the warmest places to spend a winter in Canada, St. Catharines topped that list along with a few other areas. Much to my surprise, having just been here 6 years and feeling that the winters haven't been that bad. So in my view, I'm also wondering if, although the pent-up demand, Ina, as you mentioned, will have been spent, people will have had the opportunity to come forward and buy those homes, and following that, there may be a risk that there could be a lull in that. Perhaps other people who might not have been interested in buying homes that may serve them well over winter months could also change the dynamic for Niagara in terms of the greater Niagara region, and in particular thinking about what the winters are like here. So excellent work. Karen, I'd just like to go to you for a moment, and just your thoughts, please. Are people moving from the more expensive Greater Toronto Hamilton area to Niagara? Could the pandemic and resulting changes in workplaces create or accelerate such a flow?
It's so interesting because there's much data out there that would suggest that people are looking for everything that Ina just outlined in terms of how they want to be working from home. And so, I think that what we've got is an interesting dynamic that I'm having conversations about every day that gives us a bit of a tension in our system about sort of the long-term view about where and how people want to work, with like the longer term view of how people will want to work and where they want to work. And there's inherent sort of tension in those two conversations that I think individuals, we all feel probably, but I think organizations feel that too, and are navigating sort of how do we think about where our people would like to work, how much choice are we going to present or give people in terms of how and where they want to work. So in my world, I think there's that inherent tension that many individuals, but also organizations are feeling about, is there a longer term flow out of some of the downtown core areas into more Niagara, Hamilton areas, and is that a sustainable model? As our sort of our psychology of what feels right today will likely change over the longer term as we sort of move into that second sort of time horizon that I alluded to.
Very good. And also, in keeping with that, what trends and evidence do you see in workplaces in the nature of work prior to pandemic and now? What kinds of trends are you seeing, and what do you think the longevity of those trends are into the future, Karen?
Yeah, we often talk about this as being a bit of a time machine for the whole conversation around the future of work. I mean, we were seeing a number of trends gaining momentum pre-pandemic in the form of the number of people that were working remotely was steadily going up. The number of sort of gig or freelance workers was increasing in many different jurisdictions. Organizations looking at how they could do the work that they do differently with the use of AI and robotics. We were seeing, obviously momentum gaining there. We were seeing the emergence of new roles, new types of jobs starting to come through in the areas of robotics or in the areas of manufacturing, for example. And so, and I could go on with a number of trends, but what the pandemic's done is, for many businesses in our region, has sort of accelerated our progress in those areas. And so, who knew that we would, essentially have to upskill, reskill our people to work remotely, literally over a number of days. And I've had many conversations over the last 2 or 3 years wherein we were planning to do that over 2 or 3, 4, 5 years. The whole dialogue around what are the skills for the future and how do we get our people ready to work in a much more virtual environment. to be thinking about using new technologies to enhance our experience we have with our customers and our clients. And that process of 2, 3, 4, 5 years, essentially, I'm exaggerating slightly, but not much, happened overnight for many of our businesses and for many of our employees and members of our workforce. And so, I think it's accelerated a number of these areas. I think that it has blown through a number of myths that may have been out there around how and where people can work, how they can be productive, how we can foster a sense of culture and a sense of belonging in our organizations in a different way when we're operating in a very different model than we would have ever anticipated, to the extreme, in fact. How do you manage your customers differently when you're fully virtual and remote, which obviously many of us still are today. And then it presents a number of questions again to how could we kind of harvest the good, if you will, from what we've had to do by default.
Very good. It certainly calls into question how we might, as leaders in particular, recreate the water cooler experience in building culture over virtually. And that is the challenge, isn't it, when we have such a sense of need to be among people. What I hear you saying, though, is that there are techniques, tools, and opportunities to do just that, working remotely.
100%. And I think we can get into a lot more detail on that. But, I think it does put a extra level of expectation on our leaders and managers and supervisors to really sort of make sure that they are having those regular touch points and check-ins with people. Microsoft has done a lot of research in this area around what are those moments that managers can really sort of lean into to make sure that people are maintaining the expected level of productivity in the work that they do, that they are continuing to stay engaged. All that being said, I think that you can talk to any organization today. I think people are cheering at the bit to sort of get back and have some physical proximity with their colleagues, and in some businesses that has started to happen. We're in a bit of a regression again right now, but I think that there'll be some interesting sort of hybrid models that we start seeing emerge in terms of how people maintain that connectivity and that engagement.
Very good. I'm just wondering if there are any comments from our other panelists before we move on to another topic area.
I would just like to add something, because what we do is, when we do our land use planning, we project out. We're required to project out right now until 2051 to look at the trends. I think the panelists have provided some really excellent information as to what changes there have been in the Niagara economy and what people are doing in terms of looking for housing right now and why they are. The projections that we've been given by the province for population out to 2051, we're expected to grow to a population of about 674,000 people by 2051. Now those are our population projections. In the past, we haven't achieved them. Over about the last 5 to 6 years, we have actually started to achieve our population projections in Niagara. In order to do that, we're required to, the growth rates in population have been hitting about 1.6% a year, which will get us to that population projection if we grow like that every year. And people can see, people that have lived in Niagara for a while can see the impact that 1.6% in growth has had. It has an unparalleled impact on what types of housing people are looking for and people that are moving into the region. One of the things that we do have to keep in mind, which might be a segue into the next set of questions, is there are a lot of people in Niagara who don't work from home. Our economy is based on a number of industries such as agriculture, such as tourism and hospitality, retail services. And those people don't have the benefit of working from home. So although there are a number of people coming down looking for housing that's going to suit their needs right now that are coming out of Toronto, we still have a big population of people who work here and will need to work here in the future, who need very different type of housing. So, you know, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is what is the composition of our economy and how are people that are going to come in here going to change it, but also how are we going to support what we currently have here.
Excellent segue, Doug, and thank you so much for doing that for me, because I was considering how will we do that segue to this next point. So here we go, everyone. Before March, as a community, Niagara had a number of priorities for growth and development. Some of those are continuing, some of them had to change, others have had to be abandoned. We ask if it is advisable or even realistic to forge ahead with our old plans. If we have to change course, how will we? So Doug, I might just call on you to weigh in one more time here. The nonprofit and charitable community in Niagara has stated that we have an affordable housing crisis. What effect is this crisis having on our broader community?
Okay, yeah. You know, affordable housing, there's a lot to unpack in terms of affordable housing. There's a lot of places around the world that have been going through this a lot longer than Niagara has. Again, I think it's over probably the past 5 years, we've been building up to this problem, because prior to that, there wasn't a lot of population growth. Therefore, there wasn't the same pressure on providing housing. But is there a crisis? I would say there's more of a challenge. And there have been a lot of other places around the world that have gone through this, some more successfully than others. I think what we need to do is you know, people tend to want to put out simple messages for what is a very complex challenge. What we did last year at Niagara Region is we did some significant research on housing affordability to identify what was the actual challenge that we're faced with in Niagara. And I think what that did more than anything is it put some numbers out there, but it identified there are a number of different markets within the housing market that are being faced with different challenges in terms of affordability. And when people think about affordable housing, I think they tend to think about the lowest income groups, which is a really big challenge. But there are also people in middle income groups that are challenged by housing affordability. And there are people across, the different municipalities have different housing submarkets that are facing different challenges. And those are right through from, single people across different ages, lone parents, couples with children. They're all facing housing affordability. It's not to say that they're not living in housing right now and have and are homeless. What it means is there's affordability challenges that have to be addressed across different markets in the region.
Much. Thank you, Doug. The issue of how much of income is spent on housing and a roof over your head, as opposed to some of the other opportunities and activities one might like to consider. And overlaid with that in pandemic, of course, we need to think about density and housing density. And back to Ina's comments, thinking about people that are escaping, for lack of a better word, from smaller footprints where all of a sudden finding themselves working at home in a small space, living and working in the same space, to a more expansive and roomier home as well, calls into question our ability in Niagara to create more density for people, all the while maintaining interest and opportunity to continue to grow our housing market. Ina, we've tried to focus on affordable housing, but even with the pandemic, house prices have stubbornly refused to go down. So maybe you'd like to comment on that.
I might not be able to comment on affordable project, but I can provide some insights on affordability in general. Like it's so striking how much prices have grown, like in Ontario over the past decade or two. So in fact, over the past 10 years, prices have doubled in Niagara and GTA, and prices have increased 4 times over the past 20 years, and since the beginning of this millennium. And yes, home buyers enjoyed the very low mortgage rates, but it's became much more expensive to own a house everywhere in Ontario, and mortgage payments have increased significantly. In market analysis, to get a sense when we analyze affordability conditions, how particular market is affordable and how affordability conditions change over the years, we tend to compare required income to buy an average price house, assuming 20% down and 5-year mortgage rate, and compare it with actual household incomes in this particular region. So if you look at the GTA over the past, I would say 5 years, homes haven't been affordable for the average family with average income, but I'm not talking only about single detached homes, but even townhouses. So pretty much in GTA, condo apartments are the only relatively affordable housing form remain. So what we've seen over the past years is that more home buyers in GTA needed to make a choice and compromise with their choices and move to more affordable neighborhoods, and to compromise in terms of property size and conditions, and to move outside of the region. So if I look at the situation here in Niagara, based on this year data and last year data, conditions are better because housing price is about half of the GTA level, and they're still deemed affordable for the average family. But we've reached the tipping point, and we've reached a situation where interest rates are all-time low, and if prices continue to grow and if wages slow or grow at a slow pace, conditions won't be affordable in the Niagara region as well, and it's going to happen quite soon. And it's very striking to see how fast conditions change. If only 5 years ago, Niagara region was very affordable region, and by very affordable region, I mean that the required income to buy a house here was about 60% of actual household income. So today was a situation where this parameters are the same, required and actual income about the same. So we might not see it at the same extent as we saw in GTA, where buyers needed to make choice and compromise with their choices and move outside of the region. But to some extent, we might start to see similar trends where buyers will be moving within the region and will be making choices and what they can buy, what can they afford, and we might see some even buyers moving outside of the region as a result of fast rising housing prices.
Ina, startling figures that you've raised, and Doug, it's back to your comment as well with respect to who are the people that are working in Niagara. What is the average income of the individuals that might not be the folks that have come back or are moving in from the greater Toronto, Hamilton area, but will the locals be pushed out of the housing market? That's a question I wonder if you could consider for a moment.
Thank you. I might not be the best person to answer that. Probably some of the other panelists might have more of that information. All I can say is that for our population projections and what we know now, the population is aging. I think that's a challenge that the Niagara region has been moving to for a long time. When I was growing up in this area, I know that it was a challenge to keep young people here. I think that has been the same for quite a number of years and probably getting us into the position that we're in now. And I think the challenge which I can address with some work that we've done is how to attract a younger demographic, and again, people that are in the working age that are going to support the future economy here.
Very good. Well, Karen, maybe I'll just call on you for a moment, if that's okay. And you mentioned developments in fields like robotics. Given Niagara's employment concentration in tourism, hospitality, and food, how many roughly Niagara jobs could be done without human workers?
Oh, I don't have a specific stat that I can give you there, Suzanne, but I think what it's pushed many organizations to do is, particularly those that are in sort of both service and sort of retail space in particular, it's pushed them to look at different channels to market, different platforms from a sales perspective, and so I think it's opened up because it's had to and expedited, if you will, sped up the investment, because for some that's been the channel to their customer or to their consumer, and so I think it looks slightly different in different sectors, Suzanne, but I think what it's given rise to is an increased level of curiosity around what robotics or artificial intelligence could do for the business. I still think it's early days for many of our organizations in terms of truly taking advantage of that. But I think what the pandemic thus far has done for many has allowed people to be a bit more curious, because it's for some it's been absolutely how they've had to survive. And I think when you get into some of the service areas, again, not knowing how long the current requirements for social distancing and so on will continue. I think for some of businesses that are in the hospitality space, for example, that really puts a challenge to them in terms of what is our longer term sustainable sort of approach to managing things like social distancing, to managing things like density in our real estate, and that would apply as well to more sort of knowledge work businesses as well. So I think that the limited sort of visibility we have into how long this will carry on for, and at what point we will start to open doors in the way that the doors are open pre-pandemic. I think that is probably accelerating people's need to get quite creative and curious about, is there a more longer term sustainable model, as opposed to what I think maybe some, organizations have had more of a sort of a bridge solution for different things. Now people are looking at how do we make this more sustainable, I think.
Very interesting. So, so far, just trying to recap some of the important points that we've heard. We have heard from Ina about shifting demographic moving into Niagara, the prices of houses growing, the demographic of Niagara, Doug, that's continuing to be looking outward on sort of the third trimester, but also really interested in attracting younger families into Niagara. It sees people moving about the region, couching themselves and finding themselves in different areas to work, who could work from home potentially, coupled with a number of people that continue to work in the supportive and service industries that we have within the region. One of the things that I do know about Niagara, and since coming here in 2014 from Northern British Columbia, is that there is a can-do attitude of the people in Niagara, and so it never ceases to amaze me how this group of population pull together to get things done. So while the sands are shifting and things are changing, the ability to respond and adapt in Niagara has been quite phenomenal, and to pay attention to the call of public health to do the right thing in our community has been very positive and very responsive, and we would want that. Just want to remind our viewers about our chat function and polls that are available virtually. And Brock, over to you for a moment. Since people are moving around and perhaps settling in different areas of this lovely region, what are the challenges Niagara poses for an efficient and effective public transit system? And why have we gone so long without one? And will it ever change? Over to you.
There's a lot of questions within that question, and I think this is a topic that really connects to all of the things that we've talked about before. When we make public policy decisions around things like transit, it has implications for what happens in the economy, for what happens in the housing market, etc. So just as an example, in recent years, we've had a public priority in Niagara to try to accelerate the development of GO train services coming in this direction, which means we're trying to expand the Toronto commuter shed into this region, meaning we're going to drive up housing prices, we're going to drive up demand. Some of that pent-up demand that we've already talked about is going to sort of start to extend more and more into this region. And so, there's a connection there between what we do in transit and what happens in the housing market. If we look at the future of transit, some of the things we've touched on, like artificial intelligence, become key components of where we go next. And I think that's part of what we need to think about as we contemplate directions and solutions. Historically, Niagara's been challenged on the transit side because we've been a large region geographically with a small population and a fractious system of local government that doesn't always agree on what the best policy is for implementing transit solutions. Moving forward, we're going to have to kind of think past some of those barriers, and emerging technologies may in fact be part of the way in which we contemplate that. So a lot of our historic debate has been around how do we coordinate and share bus service across this region, for example. And we've gotten substantially better at that in the last couple of years than in the past. But I think we also need to be thinking about what comes next. We are in the age, for example, of the Hyperloop technology, which we may have been watching on the news. We had the first human Hyperloop trip taken just a couple of days ago with the Virgin Hyperloop project. And that might sound like science fiction, particularly for a small region for Niagara. I'd be quick to point out that there are already 4 proposals for Hyperloop developments in the province of Ontario, including one developed by Transport Canada. I don't think we're going to have Hyperloops in Niagara, but it suggests that we need to be thinking about the next wave of transit and transportation technologies powered by forces like artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles, and to think about how we start to integrate that into the way our local transit planning is performed and the way our future transit systems are likely to operate. And this can be very practical. There's already companies. I think of an Israeli entrepreneur named Oren Shaval, who started a company called Via. It's a ride-share technology, but based on the use of AI and based on shared vehicles. And essentially, it's already operating in cities like Tel Aviv, New York City, Berlin. And what it does is to extend the public transportation infrastructure by virtue of adding in private transportation services as well, and sort of says maybe the public sector is not always best positioned to service an entire region, but we're going to see technology emerge that allows us to integrate public and private approaches in a way that allows a much more holistic transit system to serve an entire region. And as we think about the mobility of labor across a region like Niagara, how do we get farm workers to the farms? How do we get tourism workers to the tourist destinations? This is the kind of solution that I think we may be looking to more and more in the future.
So a more distributed model of transportation that might rely on public-private partnerships to get the job done. That's what you're saying. Interesting. The question it raises for me as well, though, when I think about it, is it still practical to deliver mass transport, or would we want to lean more toward the entrepreneurial approach that you mentioned with some of the smaller, more tailored options that might be available?
I'm the entrepreneur in residence at the University of Waterloo, so entrepreneurial is sort of the watchword for a lot of my approach to these things, and I recognize that may be controversial in some instances. I do think there will always be a role for the public sector in the transportation space, and particularly in terms of mass transportation and mass transit. But I think that role may be smaller in the future than it has been over the last century or so. That distributed model that you referenced, I think, is based on the notion that there are lots of small players, that there are a multiplicity of vehicle types and platforms and services available, all of which are coordinated via artificial intelligence to create a more seamless service. So I think we need to think about removing barriers to entrepreneurship as a first step to sort of realizing that potential. If we attempt to block these new technologies as they emerge, as many communities have done, for example, with Uber, we're going to kind of lock ourselves into traditional approaches and structures which rely on massive levels of public investment to sustain and to grow into the future. Whereas if we can provide a framework that allows for more entrepreneurial initiatives, we can look at the ways in which we can balance public and private interests to create a system that serves the entire community.
Oh, very good. And the opportunities that have been available to date so far in Niagara with transportation, much of it driven by our student population to begin with and moving our students around the region, all the bright young people that we want to educate here, we want them to stay here, and we want them to contribute to the Niagara economy over time. And so making transportation available and easy for folks like that, I think has sparked that entrepreneurial drive somewhat in Niagara that might not have been there before, but for Niagara College, for Brock University, and others. So it does allow us to be a bit more free thinking and looking at what are the innovations and research opportunities this could bring to our region to really develop new and different ways of doing things and stepping away from what we know and what the habit is. Speaking of stepping away and knowing what the habit is, gosh, I'm just thinking back to March and that sudden transition of all of a sudden having to work at home, do things different, set up home offices, hang different pictures on the wall, figure out how to work a virtual background so that it doesn't look like there's a weird hand delivering you coffee when you're sitting at your desk. What are some of the best practices? And maybe, Karen, you might have some insights to share on this. What are some of the best practices for working virtually?
Clearly haven't got my pictures hung up yet behind me here, so it's taken me a while. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of really good practices. But before I jump into some thoughts on that, I just wanted to add a comment on top of what you said there, Brock. I mean, around transportation. I think it's interesting as we look into that sort of shorter range view, and when we think about how users of transportation anticipate that they're going to start to use it differently, and both from a health and safety perspective and around some of those innovations that you talked about, like how can we increase consumer confidence around the health and safety of different formats. And then secondarily, and I sort of lightly touched on this earlier, as we think about people working from home and what the balance is between, for those that need to go either onto site or want to spend part of their working day in their home office, if you will. I think one of those myths that we've sort of blown through as we've migrated to the current model in many of our organizations is that there is a fixed commuter time at the beginning and the end of the day. I think we've got some optionality now. And I think people will choose to exercise that much more flexibly and fluidly than perhaps people would have done before. So back to the question around some of the best practices around working from home. I think what it's shone a light on is that a few things. So one around productivity, and I think depending on where we have been over the course of the pandemic so far, there's been varying views as whether it's had a positive or a negative impact on people's productivity, whether they're working at home or they're working in an adjusted sort of work model on site or in field. I think the consensus now is that we have got pretty smart at how to maintain more consistent levels of productivity in the work that we are doing. At the same time, though, I think that depending on which data point you're looking at, there is this constant sort of tension or struggle, if you will, around how to conserve, the beginnings and the ends of your day so that you're not on 24/7. And so, there's a lot of tactics that, I'm seeing both managers of people and individual members of our workforces sort of start to employ in terms of time management, in terms of really getting focused on the outcomes that you're driving as opposed to the time spent doing work, sitting at a desk or sitting at a workstation. And so, I think there's some very tactical things about simple things like calendar management, like, how often you're touching base with your teams to make sure that they know what they need to do and how they're going to stay focused on delivering the right work product, if you will, because we don't have those water cooler conversations as easy and in the same way. The use of technology, I think we've got a lot more mature over the last several months in terms of, using the technology, not to, we often talk about things like Zoom fatigue, and that's very, very real and has huge implications on sort of mental health and wellness, which we could talk for a very long time on, as that's we're seeing a real spike in some of those concerns around the wellness of our workforce. And so getting smart on how we use technology and when we don't use technology, and some of the new routines that we would, and I'm sure many of us have started to build into our workforce in terms of working time, in terms of some of the choices you make about whether you are using the technology or not in certain constructs. And so I think it's forcing us to think differently about making sure that we can maintain some semblance of balance and pay attention to personal and team sort of wellness, because that's a real issue right now. It's a real issue, particularly as we're getting into sort of the depths of the second wave and we're looking down the barrel of winter. There is a heightened sense of concern, I'd say, in many organizations that I'm working with around the wellness of our workforce and how we need to be really responsive and supporting from that perspective. So just a few thoughts there.
Very, very good. And the opportunity for virtual engagement with exercise and different ways to move forward on personal notes. One story that comes to mind for me right away is people saying that the time that I used to use to commute and be in my car and maybe on a virtual teleconference driving, that I'm not doing that. So now I walk my dog more. I do more things with my family during that time when I might have otherwise been commuting. So hanging on to those and really reinforcing that behavior with our workers, I think, Karen, is part of what you're saying as well. We've got some great questions coming from our audience, and this is a question to Brock. We've heard so much about business downsizing and closing during this crisis. As a specialist in entrepreneurship, can you tell us what opportunities might have emerged? Are there companies and startups that have started to grow since March, and if so, how? And I'm excluding Zoom from that.
Yeah, it's been interesting to sort of see how this has unfolded since we went into lockdown. Some of our initial assumptions, I think, have turned out to be wrong. So initially, for example, we thought because of travel restrictions, the manufacturing sector was going to go through a bit of a reorganization as we brought supply chains back closer to the sites of the manufacturing activity. I don't think that's borne out, in part because we've made transportation an essential service and allowed truck drivers and others to sort of continue to cross borders. I do think that there are a range of interesting opportunities emerging from this reality, though, and some of it connects back to these questions around transit and infrastructure and housing that we're having. So, for example, I like to point to data coming out of the UK because they're a couple of weeks ahead of the curve of us in terms of their experience of what's going on with COVID. As they moved to implement a 2-meter social distancing rule, what that meant for the typical downtown London office was a 65 to 70% reduction in the number of people who could work within that office space. That meant that the demand for office space sort of fell off a cliff. It was very expensive. You weren't necessarily seeing revenues coming in, all these kinds of factors converging to say, let's push this notion of working from home very dramatically. And in fact, we saw productivity levels of home workers rising. A study out of Stanford suggested that the typical home-based worker is 13% more productive than somebody who's working out of an office. But I think there's been a bit of a reaction to this now. As we start to think about the future of our office work, we're recognizing that we may still have to have some degree of social distancing, that we're suddenly realizing that the amount of time and productivity that we lose to the commute is just horrendous. But the British have sort of made this a key feature of their larger national economic strategy, which is known as Level Up, introduced by Boris Johnson the day after the last election. This notion that one of the things that we could be doing is driving investment, and office-related investment in particular, out of those traditional urban cores and into smaller regional centers where they can be connected by other forms of transit and transportation. And so our play over the last few years to try to bring more GO Transit to Niagara might in fact turn out to be a really savvy and forward-thinking kind of backbone to a strategy that says, how do we attract more office-related development to the Niagara region? And if we look at the potential for development of that rail corridor, development of other sort of mass transit systems that link us to a larger region, we may be able to see more of this kind of traditional knowledge work come to Niagara as a replacement for some of the activity that we're seeing lost in other sectors as a result of the pandemic. And so to me, that's a sort of a key example of some directions that we could be looking in, that there's a convergence of sort of broader societal trends and economic trends that says we've got a pretty unique and interesting opportunity in a space that we haven't really been thinking about a lot, but we've accidentally been putting some of the infrastructure in place for it for a while now.
That's very exciting. And when I hear what you're saying, I go right away to how we build and support our communities that are a bit more rural as well, and adding a population and infrastructure to more rural areas of our country to do things and to act and behave differently, to build that social infrastructure and human capital that we so desire. When we're speaking about Niagara housing prices, and Doug, it might be a question for you, or and Ina, probably you may want to weigh in on this one. When we think about that, are there a specific type of house that people really want to buy now, different than before, bigger, smaller, more grass, you mentioned, more fence, place to run in, dogs, lots of dogs during COVID. So is there a type of house in Niagara that people are more interested in than not, from your experience and knowledge?
Maybe I'll let Ina comment on that, and then I can add something after.
Great. Ina.
Niagara is still a very single detached community, ground-oriented community, but over the past years, even prior to the pandemic, we've seen quite significant changes. If 20 years ago apartments were counted only for 2% of new construction, now the share is around 15%. Last year, the share of single semi-detached and townhouses was a record high, around 40%, compared to about 20% in the beginning of this millennium. So I think the region has been moving into the right direction. And we do see examples from other areas, such as Toronto, where demand and supply didn't match, and it contributed to affordability problems and cost local population living. So we are moving into the right direction. So it's very important to anticipate migration and population changes and plan and build the right mix of homes to meet those changing needs and from the population.
Very good. Doug.
Yeah, thank you. And what I'll add to that is, again, based on some research that we've recently done. And sorry, I've gone a bit dark and mysterious here.
That's okay.
I think the sun has come out. But the research that we did, and again, it's looking forward to 2051, because the planning that we do is longer term, and basically we have to look at balancing different land uses, and which isn't always easy, and it's hard to look out into the future. But basically, what this very sophisticated research that we had done has told us is, we know that in Niagara, it's predominantly single detached housing. And as of 2016, that number was in the 68% range. So 68% of the housing in 2016 in Niagara was single detached housing. What the research has told us is that we need to over the next 20 years or so, we need to continue to build single detached housing, but we need to build more medium and higher density housing. And this, I think, when you read planning documents, if you have the fortune or misfortune of reading them, a lot of planning documents will say, yeah, every community needs a variety of housing. The research that we did for Niagara now tells us why we need that. And basically it's an economic development scenario. We know the population is growing older. What the research is telling us is, if housing continues to move predominantly towards single detached housing, we won't be able to maintain and attract the people that we are going to need to work in future industries. That's why we need more medium and high density housing. So we need medium and high density housing, and we need rental housing. The numbers that we're looking at is from 2022, every 5-year period, we need to be building in the vicinity of 4,500 units of each type every 5 years to get us there. Now, those are just numbers. Whether we achieve them or not, although that's important, isn't the point. The point is, it's to look at the diversity that we need to start bringing in. And the reason is this, the research that we did goes on to tell us that, and it's pretty logical, is that if you're trying to attract younger people to work in an industry that haven't lived in Niagara before, they don't want to have to come in and buy a house at $500,000 or $600,000 just to try out a place they haven't lived before. A lot of people like to rent, or purchase lower priced properties in order to come in and try a community that they haven't been before. And then people will, obviously, if they're younger, they want to have the option of being mobile so that they might not have to stay in a place for long. There's also the issue of students coming in. You know, students are in the same position. They don't want to have to come in and pay a lot of money for a rental unit in order to stay here and then maybe get a job and work here for a few years to try it out. Young families might not be able to afford to come in here and buy at the prices in the future years that they need to come and try it out for a job that might be offered in Niagara. And often that housing decision might be the choice as to whether or not they move here and accept the job offer. When we were putting this information together too, we had a lot of discussions with various the planning departments across municipalities, and this message was the same over and over again, that a lot of businesses they equate the availability of appropriate housing to their ability to attract future employees to support their businesses.
Excellent comments. And so what that screams at me, Doug, is tiny houses. The tiny home trend. Is there a space in Niagara?
It's not just about tiny houses. I think one of the things is in planning, what we have to do is make the conditions right for various forms of housing. I think the market tends to determine what can be built at the time. I think the challenge for us is to figure out in the future how we can build different forms of housing. And one of the things is when we talk about medium and higher density housing, we're not necessarily, when we talk about high density housing, we're not necessarily talking about achieving densities that you see around Toronto. You know, in Niagara right now, high density it could only be a 6-story building somewhere, which to some people in Niagara seems high, but it's not high by any stretch of the imagination. But we're just talking about pushing up the densities. Tiny houses may be one answer, they may not. We need a variety of solutions. I think, again, the point I would go back to is you have to look at what market you're providing the housing for. And that varies across the municipalities in Niagara.
Very good, very excellent insights. Moving toward the future as we head into the last 8 or 9 minutes of our panel discussion, there's lots of opportunities that have been described here, many different ways to look at things. A couple of the key themes: Niagara is growing, it's growing in different and unique ways. Diversity and inclusion is important. It's important for us to consider the needs of families. It's important to consider the needs of individuals who are continuing to live and work here, extended families coming to work and live with people, different kinds of jobs, working at home, commuting in transit. It's a collection of many challenging opportunities. Doug, to you, with so many municipalities that we have available to us right now, what are some of the ways that you see forward that Niagara could work together and in unique and different ways? Any comments on that?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the things is in Niagara and in Ontario, we've had this structure of a 2-tier municipal government for quite a while. I think, you know, over the times as conditions have changed, I think the governments have worked according to the challenge of their time. I think right now, and what we've heard from some of the previous comments, is there is a lot that's going on in different areas that people probably don't see simply because that's not the area they work in. I know, over the last, I've been here for 5 years now, and there's actually a lot of work that's being done to to improve systems. I mean, things can always be improved, but I think there's a lot of effort being placed in that area to improve how things are done by a number of organizations. And what my experience has been coming to Niagara, and it's not very different than any place else. Once you get people starting to talk to one another that are across different areas of profession and across the private sector and institutional departments and governments, is that people generally have the same ideas and the same understanding. It's about bringing people together and talking about it to actually get things moving. And I think that's one of the things I've seen in affordable housing isn't just the domain of one industry or one government department. It's complex, and it requires people to come together and talk about it to figure out how in each community you can address things. And I think that's what generally I've seen in Niagara, is there is that willingness to get together and to have the discussions and start figuring things out.
That's absolutely correct. And it's really about the relationships that we hold among one another that makes it most important than anything. Karen and Brock, in history, pandemics have often precipitated sweeping changes in wages, working conditions. I'm not sure if there's a fire alarm or not, or it's their way of cutting me off. But, I've had the hook, I've had numbers of things. So I might pause for direction if there Good morning. Suzanne Johnson reporting from White Oaks. We have a fire alarm during our meeting. There is not a fire, I'm happy to report, and we're just awaiting the fire department to come and turn the alarm off with their magic key. Thank you for your patience. Welcome back. Hot topic, fire alarm, that goes together. I couldn't resist it. The panel's excited to have returned. We did lose one of our panelists to a conflict. Karen had to move on to another meeting, and we are remaining here with Ina and Brock and Doug. And so we're pretty excited about that. Where we left off was, I think, at a very interesting point. And Brock had some comments all warmed up, ready to go, and had the chance while we were outside during the fire alarm to hear from Karen as well and have a dialogue. So over to you, Brock, to
and I think
go.
The question related to how past pandemics and disease outbreaks have sort of influenced the economy and reshaped things, and should we expect something like that again? And I think the classic example that historians and economists like to point to is the Black Death, the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages, where up to 60% of the population of Europe died in the space of probably 20 or 30 years. This created huge economic upheavals because it put all of the power in the economy back into the hands of the workers. There basically weren't any workers, so those who were available to work were able to kind of demand higher wages or better conditions, and it reshaped all of European society. We obviously, I mean, the pandemic we're in right now is pretty bad, but we're not seeing 60% of the population die. And so I think that the influences in the long term will be less, but I think that general principle still holds, that when we see these kinds of medical upheavals, it pushes power back into the hands of the workers. And what that means in the context of COVID is what we've been talking about all through this session, that shift to remote work, that shift to home-based work, that shift to a world in which the employer can no longer dictate the place where work is done. The employee has more influence over that. And I think that has some pretty profound implications for us as a region. We are a tourism destination. We are seen as a really nice place to go and visit because of amenities, because of climate. And in a world where the worker has more choice over where they can work from, we're likely to benefit from that. We'll also likely see the acceleration of the adoption of new technologies. You know, things like Zoom, things like the ability to work remotely have been around for years. But now we've fast forwarded through a bit of consumer resistance to the point where we all use these technologies every day. This suggests that a lot of the technologies on the horizon, and today we've talked about AI and autonomous vehicles and things like that, that the adoption curve will probably be accelerated. We will move to these tools more quickly than we might have otherwise. And that also has implications for where we're headed.
Mm-hmm. It does indeed. And we've already heard some employers announce this trend isn't a trend anymore in our workforce. We will be working from home. Ina, on that note, any comments about home office space from your housing experience? What can we do to really spice up our office world?
Maybe I can share some, like on this note, maybe I can share some interesting statistics from Stats Canada on teleworking. So when this pandemic started, Stats Canada addressed the subject by conducting surveys and doing studies. And what they determined that about 4 out of 10 jobs in Canada potentially can be done remotely. And of course, it varies significantly by the industry. Some industries have greater capacity, as high as 85%, but other industries rely very much on physical presence and have limited capacity to be done remotely. So prior to pandemic, it's interesting that the share of work like jobs done remotely in Canada was quite stable. It varied between 10 and 11%. So we had quite large unutilized capacity of jobs to be done remotely in Canada. And so since pandemic started, businesses have adapted quite fast by moving to the teleworking. And according to Stats Canada, about 27% as of now of jobs are being done remotely, which is still below our maximum capacity, but it's much higher compared to what we had before. And what Stats Canada is saying is that large areas with population higher than 500 were much faster to move to teleworking arrangement compared to small population centers. And it's likely due to different nature of works done in large areas compared to small areas. So just I would like to share my thoughts. So once pandemic is over, I don't think we're going back to the same level of capacity we're seeing today, and probably obviously not to the maximum capacity 40% capacity. We're going to still see some employers and employees moving back to the offices. We hope that secondary education students are going back to classes. But the last survey conducted by Stats Canada also revealed some interesting results. So about 35% of companies said that they have capacity of jobs being done remotely. And about 30% of those 35% companies said that they would allow their employees to continue to work remotely once pandemic is over. And about 12% of those companies, out of 35%, said that will make it mandatory. They will prompt employees to continue to work remotely. So based on those surveys, and I assume that the share of work which is going to be done remotely may increase to as high as 20% compared to 11% we had prior to pandemic, which is having quite many implications on many industries and businesses.
It does,
economy.
And it means we have room to grow in that area for sure. Doug, yeah. I'm not sure if you're still online with us here. Any final departing words before you need to go?
I am here, and thank you. I would just say we've been doing a lot of research, and when we were sort of on the break, we were talking about the data and questioning it. We've made a lot of our data available, and the important thing is that people look at it and question it and use it so that, because everybody provides a part of the solution. It's not just one organization or one group of people that's going to provide the solution to housing affordability or how we get where we want to go. It requires a lot of people from different backgrounds, different professions. So I would just encourage people to look at the data that we have, question it, use it, and get involved in the conversation of how we can address this.
Excellent. And back to your point about how our relationships are so important and that we can maintain those over the virtual networks as we've been able to, and it's a big part of who we are. Informing our policymakers with some of the data and the information that we have available will also be pretty key and important in this, and having policymakers at the table as we hear from Ina. More people working at home, what does that mean to the dynamic of the workforces and how people work together? Brock, any final comments from you that you'd like to share? Advice?
Yeah, I think I've been repeatedly struck throughout the morning about how all of these ideas begin to converge and shape each other, that none of these things can be considered in isolation. Mm-hmm. As Ina was talking about the trends towards remote working, it struck me that MLS has been releasing data about the speed at which residential properties sell, and those that are listed with home offices sell far more quickly than those that do not have home offices. That's interesting from a number of perspectives, but it directly impacts so many of the questions we're talking about today. If the demand in the market is for bigger houses that have home offices, how does that shape our affordability discussions? How does that shape the transit discussions that are going to allow people to work from home a certain number of days a week? And I think that one of the things that we really rely on to make progress in this space is going to be collaboration moving forward. I mean, just the interchange of ideas today has demonstrated how much we learn from each other. But in Niagara, where sometimes that collaboration has been a bit of a hurdle for us, it's going to be increasingly important that we learn to work together on these issues, that we learn to more effectively cooperate around finding innovative solutions to some of these challenges, and that the COVID pandemic just accelerates that need. It pushes that need to the forefront and means that we will have to continue to get better at working together.
And our call to action then from all panelists really is keep building relationships and collaborate, and removing the barriers that get in the way in front of us and our own personal biases that prevent us from doing so. And we'll find solutions to some of these wicked questions that we've heard this morning, and that's just been fantastic. Thank you so much, Ina and Doug and Brock and Karen and Absentia. Thank you. People can still find poll results on our site just below the video. And it's just been a pleasure being here with you today. Appreciate your patience, and opportunity to hear from our guest panelists has been most exciting and informative. Thank you kindly. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes the second of our three-part series of our Economic Summit. I wanted to thank our moderator and panelists for approaching today's discussion with substance and insight, a real treat of a dialogue that opens minds to the forces that will shape our recovery. And this dialogue was also made possible because of our partners: Niagara Region Economic Development, Goodman School of Business, Brock University, Niagara College, DDL and Company, RBC, Deloitte, BDC, Niagara Workforce Planning Board, Pegasus Aviation, Easy Rock 105.7, and Newstalk 610 CKTB. Thank you for all that you do for the community. And to all attendees, thank you for being part in today's session. Please join us next week for the last of our series, a link which can be found on our website at gncc.ca. Thank you.